morning, everyone. So great to be here. All right, I'm here to talk to you about testing UI, and specifically the more technical part of testing, the developer side of testing. So who here is a developer? Like I'm really eager to, quite a lot actually. That's nice. Who here uses Storybook? Even more, that's amazing. Oh, so this is my audience. So this is me. I'm Gert Hengeveld. I'm from the Netherlands, so yeah, you can butcher my name. It's fine. I work for an American company. It's called Chromatic, so they always butcher my name, right? So that's what I'm used to. So I'm a staff software engineer over there. I've been involved with Storybook over the past 5 years since I worked at Chromatic, actually a little bit before then. But I only joined the Storybook team over at Chromatic like 6 months ago. But over the years, I've contributed to Storybook and kept a good eye on it. But before then, I was an engineer on Chromatic. So I kind of know both sides of the fence there. There isn't actually a fence. But anyway, for those of you who don't know, Storybook is an open source project. And it's kind of been adopted by Chromatic. Chromatic is a US-based company, a startup. We have a SaaS product. I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. But we have an entire team on staff to work on Storybook full-time. So that's our way of contributing back to open source. So for those of you who don't know, everyone knows this, right? User interfaces these days are built with components. Like we're talking about design systems, which end up being like a whole bunch of components in like a nicely documented, very structured and systematic way, right? But like all those components, they come with a bunch of complexities. For example, every component has endless variations of things like their states that can be, like you have your loading state, your disabled state, and progress state, errors, whatnot. A bunch of edge cases you need to consider, like does it have a long, very long label? What happens, right? Does it have extreme numbers or missing data? We've seen some examples the past 2 days. Or the context, like your language, location, color preferences, and that sort of thing. And then all the countless combinations of these things make for a situation where, well, components can really quickly get out of hand and become really complicated. And covering all these permutations is a lot of work. So say we have this one component. I have 4 stories because it's got 4 variants, which is actually pretty simple. And then a bunch of browsers that I want to test it in, and a bunch of viewports like mobile that I also want to check its behavior in. Yeah, you can see how with hundreds of components, or maybe thousands of components, this really gets out of hand. So what happens is you have one component and it's being reused in a bunch of different places, right? That's what we want with components. We want to reuse them. So in this one place, everything's fine. It's the second place, everything's fine. But this third place, what happened? It's just, I don't know, positioned wrong. And this sort of bug can slip through undetected very easily. So let's take a little example, like MongoDB, a publicly traded company. It's a database company. It's kind of, they have a humble button component. Who here has a button component? Right? So you don't even need to raise your hands. I know everyone's got one. But this button component, of course, it's being used all over the place in all of their applications, right? And here's just 2 examples of how components compose, right? So you have a modal where this button also lives, and in this case, it's in a focus state, right? There's a dropdown where it's actually a button with some side button, and well, that has kind of resulted in, well, it needs all these variants, right? This button needs a lot of variants of itself, considering size, and maybe an icon is in there, the position of that icon, the color of the button, whether it's in the loading state or in the dark mode, right? And so for MongoDB, their example, this button component really gotten out of hand. There is more than 1,500 variations of a single component. So yeah, and that's just a button. So yeah, Storybook is our answer to helping you develop all these components in a way that you can structure them, that you can work on those components in isolation so you don't have to consider the context of a fully fledged running application somewhere that you need to spin up and manage. And of course, if you're working on a design system, kind of don't really have any other choice but to run your components in isolation because you typically aren't actually working on an app, right? So another part, what we've been strongly focused on over the past year or 2 years at Storybook has been testing those components, right? And of course, also documenting those components. And Storybook is well known for its capability to document components. But testing is now more and more becoming like very important for especially, well, these complex situations like the MongoDB example. So for anyone who doesn't know, Storybook is an application you runs on your local machine, and what you do in your code while you develop a component, you also have next to your badge.js file, you also have a badge.stories.js file in this example, and you specify your stories as a JavaScript object, and that's how this system works in a nutshell for anyone who isn't an engineer out there. But yeah, we've been talking a lot about all the tooling for designing and documenting, all those sort of thing, on the design side of thing over the last couple of days. Storybook really is very much on the other side of the spectrum for developers, really tailored to developers. And it's really become the industry standard for UI development. So GovUK has come up before, like it's one of those companies that use, organizations that use Storybook, right? Testing all this UI code is really hard. Here's my broken heart emoji. Components they break in unexpected places, like the quick example I showed you. But for example, say you have a component where all of a sudden there's a very long label on it and it wraps to the next line, and that's why it no longer fits in its place, and so your UI is all messed up. And in worst scenario, it's no longer clickable, for example, and your UI just doesn't work at all anymore. Testing all of the scenarios, like I explained, this is a lot of work. It's not something you can realistically do manually. I mean, there's always some sort of manual step involved, but ideally we would want to automate all those things. Reproducing a specific state is very tricky. Storybook has a concept of controls to help you like kind of fiddle around with your component to like to search for these extreme cases, for example. But if you were running in like a live application, you might have to go into the database to change some data in there to make sure to trigger an error state, for example. Well, that's the sort of thing that's annoying to reproduce. And tooling. Tooling hasn't historically been tailored to UI testing. Like the most of the tooling that we've been using is tooling for. I'm speaking of like developer tooling, more for backend development, really, not so much for eyeballs on things. So, how do you test UI anyway? Well, manual testing. I just touched on it briefly. It's always something everyone does, but it's not really scalable. Especially if you have 1,500 variations in one component, are you really going to check all of them? No, of course not. But like I said, some part of it is always going to be manual work. End-to-end testing is like the next way to automate things, right? So typically, when you're building web components for the web applications, you do end-to-end testing, browser automation to like go to a website, click around, and type some text into the input box and see what happens, right? But this is a pretty heavyweight solution, and it's hard to orchestrate. It doesn't scale very well either because those solutions are typically fairly slow, and they have to run in parallel if you're running against like a staging environment application, for example. And then there's unit testing, which is kind of like, at least historically, been like pretending your UI is an algorithm. Data goes in, data goes out, and we validate that this output is somehow what we expect. But if it's UI, how are you going to verify that it's actually the right shade of green, right? I mean, you could potentially check with a unit test that it's the right color code, but doesn't actually prove that it's actually green. And then, of course, there's many more flavors of testing that I'm actually not going to touch on. The Storybook way, and we're really betting on this, is component testing. And component testing, you can sort of like think of it as manual testing, end-to-end testing, and unit testing combined. It's really, we're looking for the best of all worlds in this situation. It takes the best parts of these three types of testing and groups them together as one thing. So component testing in the Storybook way is putting your actual live UI component right next to the execution of the test. And even putting your test code, the description of like the assertions and the interactions, right inside of your story file so that you don't have to additionally write a test file. So you write stories with assertions in them. Those stories become automated tests. So what we've done is we are taking your story file, your stories file, and we're automatically converting it into a vtest test file. And then we're passing that into vtest to run, to execute it. So, and then inside of Storybook, we have a tests panel that visualizes all the steps that happen, all the interactions that happen, and you can actually step through these things like a time travel debugger sort of thing, and debug the tests inside of the browser, inside of your actual development browser, the one that you picked yourself and not the one that happens to run inside of Playwright. And nice thing about working with like using vtests in our case is you get the ability to measure code coverage. And all of this is actually already available right now in Storybook 8.3. Released it just a couple weeks ago. So code example, I promise I don't have all that much code. Here's what we call a play function. So this is a story definition for a submitted state of a form. And the way it's defined is it uses simulated events to trigger a type into a search box and then click the search button. And then finally, we make an assertion with the expect function to check that some function has been called. And the nice thing about this sort of thing, by the way, this is interaction testing, which we released actually 2 years ago already. We're just building, iterating on top of that. This runs in any browser, and just the browser you happen to use to develop your UI components. You get an interactions log, like I mentioned, and then you can even like just use your dev tools, inspect elements on the page, like even midway through your test run. You can pause it right there and say, okay, I want to fiddle with my DOM state, inspect some elements, and see what's going on. So let's do a quick little demo of what's new in Storybook 8.3. So what we've done is I have an example application here. It's called Meal Drop. And I've set up vtest here to run some tests. Now let me run these tests. And I'm running them with code coverage reporting. You see, I have a couple tests. But these tests are actually only just for my hooks here. So my source code only has 2% code coverage, which is pretty appalling. But that's because I only executed unit test, the plain regular unit test for like some hook, some simple behavior. But in all honesty, I have all of these stories for various pages and for various components. Take my badge component, right? I have all these stories, and those stories are actually also testing your UI components. So let me go into my terminal and run, where is it? There we go. npx storybook add the experimental test add-on. I'm just gonna run this live demo. This is gotta install some stuff. And this is how easy it is to add this add-on to Storybook. What it has done is it has like added it to my package.json, generated a vtest workspace file, which extends for my Vite configuration, and it added the Storybook config. Also, I'm getting a vtest setup file over here. These are implementation details that you don't need to be bothered with. But what this gives me is when I execute my tests again, it takes a little longer, because what it actually does now is spin up Playwright with vtest browser mode to execute all of my components, my stories, inside an actual browser. So it spun up Chromium in the background using Playwright, instrumented by vtest, and now, lo and behold, I actually should have, there we go, 88% code coverage now. And I didn't actually really do all that much more work. But this just proves that these stories aren't just for documenting your components, it's also actually testing all your source code. All right, let's jump back. So what's the next step? The next step for Storybook is to unify UI testing. So we've been doing all this work to integrate with the ecosystem, like with vtest, to make sure that we interoperate with what's already there, like standing on the shoulders of giants. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we do want to give every developer out there a much better experience than what vtest out of the box provides. Like running a UI test in a command line interface has always kind of felt wrong to me, especially when something goes wrong. When it's broken, you get sort of like a stack trace and a snapshot of the HTML in text that you then have to mentally parse to figure out what's going on. What happened to the UI aspect of this thing, right? So unify UI testing is our next goal. And that's actually a project I've been working on for the past couple of months, to be able to run all of these tests right from inside of Storybook, the Storybook UI. So, and what this does is it gives you just the ability to trigger these things. You don't need to worry about command line interfaces, terminals, whatnot. Click this button, and it will execute your component tests with vtests and visual tests with Chromatic, if you have it set up. It reports the statuses back into the sidebar. So you see these red and yellow dots there. So it highlights which components, which stories have errors and warnings on them. And this can include, eventually, not yet, but soon, accessibility testing, for example, where you get warnings about the accessibility of your components right inside of Storybook. You can connect multiple test providers. So right now we're starting out with component tests and visual tests. But anyone in the community could introduce additional test providers if they wanted to. We are implementing a generic API inside of Storybook. It's like an add-on to Storybook to add a test provider. You can toggle watch mode for test providers that support it. So in this case, vtest can run in watch mode. So whenever you save your component file or your story file, you make a change, you save it, it just automatically runs. You don't even need to think about it, but it does report back into Storybook with the latest status. You can run per component or per story. So that's what this looks like. So when you can like click this drop-down menu on the story and say, okay, just run the component tests for this particular component, or for this particular story, or for this folder of stories inside of Storybook. So you don't always have to run everything if you don't want to. And finally, there's these little badges, the red and yellow badges at the bottom. Click those things to filter the sidebar to only show the errors. So the nice thing about it is you run it once, a bunch of stuff is reported, filter your sidebar, and now you know, oh, these are the things that I need to check, right? Before I commit any code, this is what I will be working on. And finally, visual testing with Chromatic. So with Chromatic, we've released a visual test add-on a little while ago already. One actually, who's used this thing yet? Anyone? Handful. All right, so what this does is it allows you to, at the click of a button, take screenshots of your UI components and compare them over time. That's what Chromatic does. Excuse me. Chromatic publishes your Storybook on our CDN, either publicly or privately, which allows you to share your Storybook with your coworkers. And then we have a workflow that allows you to approve and track changes over time. We call them baselines. So each time you run what we call a build, we take new snapshots of your component, and the next time you change some code, you run a new build, and we check the pixel by pixel, basically, your screenshot against the previous version of that component. So now with Chromatic, with Chromatics, you are actually able to check whether green is actually green, right? In fact, we've extended this to a visual UI review workflow, which is like code review on a pull request on GitHub, for example, but visually. So we take your main branch and your feature branch, you put them side by side. We show you all the screenshots of the things, and we highlight what's changed. So you can assign a designer or a product owner to go and review those changes to figure out, is this what I'm actually intending to ship, before you hit that merge button on the pull request. We have, of course, like a commenting system, so you can gather feedback from your stakeholders. And finally, we synchronize status to GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket to prevent your pull request from getting merged until all the feedback has been resolved. I have another screenshot here. The accepting, like in green, you see highlighted what's changed. Like we found changes on this snapshot. We highlight what's changed. You are able to accept those changes right there, so that the next time this new snapshot is the baseline, and we compare against that for the next one. If there's anything you take away from this, from my presentation just now, is that when you write your stories, you get tests for free. Thank you.
Give it up for Gert!